Welcome to the Modern Monk podcast. This is episode number 8. My name is Cormac Taylor. I'm here with Toby Chilva. How you doing, Tobes?
Feeling good, ready to rumble.
Excellent. Today we're talking about personal standards. So to begin, what are personal standards?
To me, it's the terms of the contract that you write with yourself for what is acceptable. It reminds me a lot of when we talk about desire and that being a contract of unhappiness with yourself until you obtain something. I kind of see personal standards explained in a similar way. They're really just the terms that you agree to, what's acceptable to where I'm okay with this behavior or this action. You know, where do you draw that line? That's what I see it as.
Okay, so for you these are the actions that are acceptable for me to do, regardless of whether those actions are what you perceive as good or bad. It is just what is acceptable for you. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, and I think that like internal acceptance is something that's maybe harder to define so succinctly in words, but it's definitely a feeling that everyone's felt before when they've done something that they know is against their personal standards. It doesn't feel right. You know, there's probably a bit of shame. You're not living up to your best self. You can feel that, and I think the opposite is true when you exceed or when you meet your personal standards, and especially consistently. There's that sense of self that's like solidified, and that identity that comes with like repeating these behaviors. Like, yes, this is what I said. This is the agreement I made with myself that this is what is acceptable, and I've met that. Like I've proved to myself that I'm accountable.
And one of the words you said there, which was feeling, and I think that's an interesting point, is you can kind of feel when you're slipping below those standards or where you're above those standards. But particularly when you're below those standards, you can definitely feel yourself slipping, and you can feel, oh, this is not what I do. This is not who I am. And it's very noticeable, don't you reckon?
100%. And it's really not a nice feeling. No. You start to like hate yourself, or, you maybe hate yourself is a bit too strong, but it can feel like that in moments where, you're really self-critical, because there's now a standard that you're holding yourself to. And so anything below that, even if it's a good attempt and there's things that happened out of your control, it can create this like negative self-perception of a period of time. And it is also something that comes in waves, ebbs and flows with momentum. It's easy to slip from standards and kind of domino into multiple standards being completely lost or dropped, in the same way that usually when you're taking steps and strides in one direction, everything will move with momentum.
Okay. So yeah, I think I might see personal standards a little bit differently to you, because the way I see personal standards is the set of actions that you do and the set of actions that you avoid despite motivation. So when I think of personal standards, I think about what is the kind of person that you are when you're not at your best. Because when we have these periods of motivation, if you look back over the course of the year, we're getting to the end of the year now, a lot of us can look back over the course of the year and say we've had moments of motivation and then moments of lack of motivation, and they came with a certain set of actions when you had motivation and a certain set of actions when you didn't have motivation. And I think that set of actions that you do when you don't have motivation, that is your standard. That is your baseline standard of who you are, who you decide to be. And then all the actions that you decide to take when you have momentum, when you have that bit of motivation, those are the extras. But I think the personal standards is the base. It's the baseline of who you are. And that's why I think they're so important, because if we can continue to raise the base, raise the floor, rather than continuing to raise the ceiling when we have peak motivation, if you can continue to raise the floor, the standards, then there's only so far you can fall. And if there's less distance that you can fall, there is greater growth that you can make over a long period of time. And we'll talk more about that later in the episode, but I think it's very much the foundation of the actions that you take.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting way to think about it. How have you come to that conclusion? Like what's led you to thinking about how people act in periods of low motivation?
Well, when I think about the actions that I would choose to take when I'm motivated, they're certainly very different to the actions that I take when I'm not motivated. And when I really think about it, the person that I am deep down is that person that I am when I'm not motivated. the extra that I get from being motivated, the extra, that is a small glimpse into the future of what my standards could become. But right now, I am my standards. Right now, you are your standards. And when I think about standards, I just think about it as the baseline of who you are. And to answer your question, I'm not entirely sure how I came to that conclusion, but that is just what feels right to me when I think about what personal standards are.
Could it maybe be something to do with, like, your identity is a constant? You never lose your identity. Like, there's always a level of identity that's there. Motivation is not constant. It's something that comes and goes. So therefore, your standards, which are basically, form a lot of your identity, can't be tied to actions that are related to motivation, which do just come and go. It has to be something that's constant, that's always there. And what are those actions? What are the standards what are the actions, what are the standards you fall to when there's lack of motivation? I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and what are the things that you actually said a few weeks ago? I think this was when we were talking about side quests, is that you said you are the sum of your actions, right? And to take that a step further, well, not even just take that a step further, you are the sum of your actions, but the sum of your actions is the sum. It is what you do across the course of the year, not at peaks and troughs. And if you are the sum of your actions, then you are the sum of your standards, and therefore you are your standards. And that's, I think, where we're both drawing the correlation between our standards and our personal identity. Because if you are your actions and your standards are the base actions that you would take, then I guess that's where you would draw that line between the personal identity and the standards.
Definitely. I almost think I've approached this slightly from a standards from an ideal point of view. Like the standard you set that's slightly on an incline horizon, whereas you're talking about the standards of right now, that you're proving to yourself that it's not an ideal that you're trying to meet. It is where you currently are. Yeah, which is interesting because it instantly puts into perspective the fact that standards exist on a continuum and they're dynamic. They change, they move depending on whether you're thinking about the past, the future, or the present.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Which I guess leads me into how do personal standards impact long-term growth specifically?
Well, based on the way I'm thinking about actions as the base actions that you take despite feeling motivation or momentum or anything, fundamentally actions influence change. The only thing that can really influence proper change in your life is the actions that you take. And if your standards are the baseline actions that you take, the more we can increase the standards, the more we can increase the strength of the baseline actions that you take, then the greater the actions that you're going to take. And if the actions are the things that are influencing long-term growth, then this is what is going to make the big changes in the long term. The higher your standards are, the higher your long-term growth potential is, because you're just taking better actions on a more consistent basis. Of course, that's going to improve long-term growth.
Yeah. No, the way I was picturing that in my head is if you're trying to climb as high as possible, your standards are almost like what % incline are you walking at? There might be periods of motivation where you climb a ladder or you take some steps, but your standards are like, okay, well, what percentage do you fall back down to when you're just trudging along, walking? Exactly. Is it 0.5%? Is it negative? Is it 5%? And like you can think about even just a 5 to 6% in an incline, the difference that makes over a 10-kilometer walk is a huge amount of elevation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we have these periods of motivation, what we're doing is we're increasing our actions above what our baseline already is. But if we're increasing the baseline, then it just means that when we're in periods of motivation, we're going to grow more. And as we know, we're going to have these oscillating periods of motivation and lack thereof. So when you zoom in on it, it looks like there's a bunch of change happening. But if you zoom out, it's going to be essentially a straight line. And that's what you're talking about, is that incline. And I think if the standards raise, we're changing the angle of the growth in a positive way. So the more we can tilt up the standards, not only the higher our potential is when we're in periods of motivation, but also the higher our floor is, which is going to give us that incline for large-scale, long-term growth, I think.
Yeah, and what I love about this question is it highlights how things that seem so small or not as impactful as these like large life altering decisions. This question really highlights that the compounding effect that just a long-term horizon will have when you have something that affects you so fundamentally, even if it is just incremental or it's a small percentage, you can really start to think about, okay, well, like 10 years down the line, 50 years down the line, what is this one thing, how much, difference has that created in my life?
Yeah.
You can really start to understand how it's affecting you when you look at it on the macro scale.
Yeah, and we constantly are talking about long-term growth and specifically compounding. And the actions will compound over time. And the greater the actions are, the greater the compounding potential, which means the greater that growth is. When you talk about getting on that compounding graph, as soon as you can get on there, start taking those actions, the sooner you're going to start getting that exponential return that you're going to get from those actions.
I think this might be the episode where we draw graphs with our hands the most amount of times.
There's a lot of movement for people just listening to this.
You're going to be visual. I hope you're a visual learner.
Yeah.
Yeah, but for me, when I think about long-term growth and personal standards, I think about myself carrying a rock, and that being me, doing the hard things that are making me better, that are getting me towards my ideal self. And I see my standards as a rock that's on the ground that my foot's tied to. And so there's a bit of slack in that rope. And I walk with the rock I'm carrying, which is like, periods of motivation. And then I have to stop and I have to turn around and I have to pull this rock towards me to where I am. And I kind of see that as the cycle of, in these periods of motivation or when things are going well, you start doing better behaviors or actions that used to take more motivation or were more difficult. And then that period of motivation diminishes and you're left standing way above where your standards were. And you have this moment where you either pull the rock towards you, which is almost just as difficult to then reset your standard to where you are, or you have to walk back to the rock or the rock doesn't move. Yeah, I see the standards as that rock. You're tied to it. There's only so much that you can deviate from that rock before you're drawn back to it. So ultimately, you think about long term, you're going to need to move the rock that you're tied to just as much as you need to, move this rock that you're carrying.
And it's almost like an elastic band, not even a rope. Whereas you continue to walk away from your standards and you can continue to move, but eventually that distance between you and the rock is going to provide so much tension that it's going to either pull you back or you have to pull it with you to make sure there's enough slack for you to keep going.
Yeah. I mean, you could go even further and say almost like the strength of character is how much do you dig your heels in and allow the rock to be pulled to you rather than being pulled back. Because, that's a period where it's really difficult. It's just really difficult to improve your standards and then set that as your baseline, because your baseline is, as you said, it's what you do when, when you feel like shit or when you have, nothing left in the tank. So to improve, even be making small improvements in that is a big shift and is mentally a big challenge.
Yeah, 100%. And when we talk about standards as the thing that you're doing on a consistent basis regularly, if these are actions that you're doing on a consistent basis regularly, that brings us to our favorite word, which is consistency. So if we are consistently applying certain actions, these are going to have big effects long term because we know the power of that consistency. So as you say, making those really small changes in your standards is going to have significant impacts because by definition, if it is a standard, it implies consistency. So if we can make those small improvements, those small changes, this is going to unlock big growth.
Yeah. Okay, now I want to know, what are your personal standards that you've set for yourself?
Okay. I'm going to start this by saying that this has developed over the course of the year. I didn't start with these set of standards. This has happened over a period of time. So when you hear this, I don't want you to be thinking, okay, well, I need to have my standards exactly like this from the beginning, because this developed over the course of months. But my journey towards improving my standards started at the beginning of this year, where I said, okay, I'm not going to consume online entertainment by myself. I set myself that standard of when you're alone, when no one else is around, you cannot consume any online entertainment, right? You can't scroll your phone, you can't watch YouTube videos, you can't watch sport, you can't watch TV, you can't do any online entertainment, you can't keep up with politics, you can't be on social media, you can't do any of that. That was my first standard that I set for myself, and I was very strict with that. I said, this is absolutely a standard that you have to hold for yourself. And that was really good because it allowed me to make progress in silence behind the scenes where people weren't watching, which was really beneficial. And that unlocked a lot of these other standards that I then developed over the course of the year. But I started the year with this one standard I set for myself. Then, a few months later, I wanted to build the personal brand. So I said, okay, there is a set of inputs that are going to allow me to grow a personal brand. So I set some standards for uploading content. It started off with 3 YouTube videos every week. And that started in March of the year. And then maybe August of the year, I said, okay, I want to start uploading short form content. So then I said, okay, I'm going to upload 7 pieces of short form content per week. And then we started the podcast, and it's now, okay, and I'm going to do 1 podcast a week. Those are my standards surrounding posting content and building the personal brand. I also had lifting goals, which was I want to do 4 workouts a week. I set myself that goal, boom, done. And then a little bit later, I had the running goal, and it was 3 runs a week. Maybe 3 or 4 months later, I said, okay, I want to learn Spanish. So I decided to say, okay, you are going to spend on average 4 hours a day learning Spanish. And I've done that for the past 4 months. Now, I didn't say, okay, these are all of your standards, do these all at once. These very much developed over time, but I've been very conscious of these. You cannot fall below this standard. For me, I refuse to fall below that standard and not meet those tasks, because I know that those are the biggest levers that are going to allow me to achieve the results I want to achieve. So I just said, okay, you cannot fall below. This is your standard. You will not fall below this. And so far, I haven't fallen below any of those standards. But it was very much saying, okay, these are standards. This means that no matter how much motivation you have to do this. And that's what my standards look like for this year. And it's developed a lot, but here we are.
Yeah. I mean, a lot to digest there. I think what I want to start with by asking you is, when in those moments when you want to break the standard, the craving comes in, the impulse is there, what are you doing in that moment? Because that is the only moment that matters, and it is the moment that everyone struggles with the most.
Mm-hmm. Well, for people who aren't familiar, I created myself this system. I call it the Fortress system, and I use this specifically to get rid of online entertainment. And the system essentially means that you might have a trigger, as you say, like a craving to do a certain action. Between having that trigger to do an action and taking the action itself, you have to go through different layers of yourself to take an action. So those layers would include your personal beliefs around that action, your personal identity around that action, the social implications associated with you doing that action, the access that you have to doing that action, and then lastly, your willpower. For most people, they forget about the first 4 and they just focus on willpower. And I think if that was the case for me, I couldn't do it. For me,
I'm going to tell you, you couldn't do it. No. It's not I think you couldn't do it.
No.
You couldn't do
Absolutely not. No way.
I couldn't do it. I don't think anyone
Impossible.
Can do it.
So I've continued to use this through a lot of different behaviors, but it started with online entertainment, and I started with access, because access is the highest leverage thing that you can do that is mainly set and forget. So for example, okay, I want to stop playing video games. Well, if I didn't have a PlayStation in the house, if I didn't have any games on my phone, if it was impossible for me to access video games, then I'm not going to be able to do it. And I essentially did that for every single piece of online entertainment. And that was a really, really good at the start. But then after a while, especially when I started posting content about living without online entertainment, first of all, it added social implications. If I decided to start playing video games or scrolling by myself, I would essentially be lying to hundreds, thousands of people, right? There's a big social implication there. I never want to lie, so that's not going to be good. Then after a while, this also developed my beliefs and personal identity. After a while, I became the person who doesn't consume online entertainment by myself. And I believe that so intrinsically that it became a part of my identity. And that's how I was able to strengthen all of the layers of the fortress. So for me, it's almost impossible to use online entertainment by myself because I'd be lying to thousands of people. It would be completely against my character and who I am. I probably couldn't even do it because I have so many access prevention methods in place that it would be impossible. And because of the downstream effects of removing online entertainment, I do have good willpower now. But I've used that model to make it very difficult, especially in moments of weakness, to actually do something that I know is my standard. I do not fall below this. So that has been the way I've gone about trying to not use or not do anything that I'm not supposed to do.
What's it called again?
The fortress method.
I mean, it's crazy because when you lay it out like that, it makes it seem like, oh, that was easy then, like because they're all leveraging each other, they're all helping each other, and when at the end when you get to the fully built fortress and it has all these layers, it's like, well, yeah, now you can't do it. It's it goes against who you are and everything else. So it's I mean, it's really interesting to hear you talk through your experience of building this system, because I mean, it's allowed you to do some pretty crazy things.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to just apply to online entertainment. You can apply this to a lot of other areas of your life. If you're trying to not eat junk food, don't have junk food in the house. Tell people you don't eat junk food, right? Become the person who doesn't eat junk food. Now you're going against your identity. You can't even do it in the first place, and you'd be lying to a lot of people, right? You can do all of these things to build the fortress in all different areas of your life. I use it specifically for online entertainment because I think it's one of the biggest unlocks for people, getting rid of that. But yeah, you can really use that anywhere in your life, and it's been eye-opening for me how simple it can be, but it's just in the vague, it seems very difficult.
I mean, yeah, it is simple, I guess, but no one's doing it. Like, no one gets a bunch of motivation and then sets up all of these things. Like, they just go, I have a bunch of motivation, so my willpower is really high, so I'm gonna do 3 days of like cold turkey, bare knuckle, whatever, and then it falls away because willpower goes away just like motivation does.
That's a really good point. I think a lot of people when they have motivation and willpower, they think they're going to have it forever. So they do the things that they can do right now rather than thinking, how do I prevent myself from falling back to my old standards? Because a lot of people don't even think it's possible. They think, oh, I'm always going to feel like this. I don't have to worry about the time where I'm hungover on a Sunday morning and I really want to start scrolling TikTok or Instagram. No one's thinking about that. Everyone's like, oh, I'm motivated right now. I'm always going to be motivated. So let me just go all in and just do all these things and not worry about what's going to happen when I'm not feeling 100%.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes from the shame around not identifying what your standards really are. Because if you never really have that conversation or think about it with yourself, what do you do at your worst when you have low motivation? Like, it's really embarrassing stuff that no one ever wants to tell other people that they do. So of course you're not going to bring that to the forefront of your mind when you are feeling good to then try and protect yourself. It's kind of something you just throw in the back closet of your mind. As oh, that's not me. That's just, that's just after I've had 6 beers and had no sleep. Like, that's what I do. That's not the real me. Well,
yeah.
Like, that is your standard. That is you.
Exactly. And speaking of that, what are your standards?
My standards have been set working backwards from my values. But again, like I was just saying, it started from identifying what my standards were, which was this kind of journey of discovering the worst parts of yourself. What are the worst parts of yourself? Who do you become when you're at your worst, lowest motivation? You're angry at yourself or the world, or you're doing things in spite. You have to recognize these patterns that you're falling into, and you have to identify them and say, and you have to identify and say, this is me, and you have to own it. Because until you do that, you're never going to change from it. You're never going to see it as a problem, and you're never going to be able to put the barriers in place to stop it from reoccurring. Essentially, you're never going to be able to improve your standards. Once I was able to own who I was at my worst, I then allowed myself to think, okay, well, what values does my ideal self have? They're honest. Okay, if I want to be honest, I need to not lie to people. So that is then a standard that I'm going to set for myself. And maybe a slightly different approach that we had was I was much more feeling based. When I felt the slip of a standard or the temptation to break it, that fear of not meeting the ideal self or the shame of returning to that self that I'd identified previously was the indicator for the action. But it really did all just come from the values thinking of my ideal self, honesty, health, so gymming and diet. This is the first year where I can confidently say for 12 months of the year, I put consistent effort into exercising and eating well. And I think that comes from the identification of standards and this being like a long-term consistent ideal that you set for yourself. Because before this, it had all just been periods of growth and decline, in periods of motivation and low motivation and changing priorities. Because, 3 months of the year, my priority might have been the gym when I really wanted to hit a certain weight. And then something new and flashy came into my life and that was my newest priority. And if you never identify the worst, standard, you just get, your attention gets pulled to the next flashy thing. And whatever you were working on recedes back to exactly where it was. And so it was kind of a big shift in identity that these are all elements of yourself. All of these actions are creating your identity and they all need attention and there's standards that need to all be raised. So yeah, I think it's an interesting self-discovery exercise really, what it begins with.
I really like that you're talking about identifying yourself at your worst, because it's not something that I really thought about, but it's a really good point. You have to understand who you are at your worst, because a lot of the time we don't want to think about that. We don't want to think about how bad we have been at times throughout the year, but it's a really important thing to identify, because if you just choose to ignore it, history tends to repeat itself and it's going to come up again and again and again until you properly identify it and identify what your standards actually are.
Yeah, and the more it comes up and you don't identify it or face it, the harder it becomes to identify it and face it because it becomes more of your identity. Yeah. If it's only happened 2 or 3 times, and you face it then, you can say, okay, well, this is a pattern that seems to be happening. Maybe this is thinking about how it happens, and you face it and you change it. If it's something you've done for 5 years, it's a lot harder to own that because it's more deeply rooted in who you are.
And we might have talked about this in the previous episode as well. When you choose to ignore things and continue to ignore them, it's not only that you have the same problem, it's that the problem seems bigger to you. Every day that you put it off and you don't think about it and you don't address it, it just becomes a bigger and bigger problem that you're just hiding and just letting occupy your mind and occupy your thoughts. If you can attack it straight away and just identify the problem, you can come up with a solution a lot quicker, and it's not going to be there rotting away in your brain and just holding you hostage, essentially.
Yeah, and what a terrible way to live life, being held hostage to things that you don't want to own about yourself, and not even being able to identify that that's the reason it's causing you to feel this way or do these things.
Yeah,
it's you're almost like giving that self control over the rest of you by not identifying it. It's playing puppet to you because you're not going to have motivation, and then it's going to draw you back.
Yep.
Simple as that.
I agree. Okay. What do you not tolerate now that you used to?
I mean, doom scrolling and solo entertainment are a big one that come up for me. And I mean, that journey for me has taken stages. It wasn't like, okay, I realized this is the problem and it's gone. It was, at this volume, it's a problem. I need to cut it to this volume. On these situations, it's a problem. I need to cut it to this. Which is an interesting experience I had thinking about this topic. Was that me just putting off the fact that this was a big identity problem for me and breaking it down into smaller chunks so I could tackle it? Probably. But is that a bad way to go about it? I don't think so. Because like we said, you can't bite off more than you can chew in these situations, because you're going to end up spitting it out and you're going to default back to old standards. So yeah, I mean, doom scrolling was incremental one for me. In general, just control of my time. I mean, a big realization that I had this year is that I'm committing to becoming an entrepreneur, and I don't want to work, a contracted job 40 hours a week for someone else. That was essentially came from me identifying that I want to control what I do with my time. And that was something that I just used to tolerate. Okay, 40 hours of my week, I've just signed that away, and I can tolerate that. I'll live with the rest of the hours that I have. And that was something that I had to identify, own, and then realize that I want to change and set that as a standard. And obviously there's lots of things that I've had to put in place to be able to make that change. But yeah, it's interesting. We're talking about what you tolerate. And what you tolerate changes over time based on what you're doing. But it's one of these, again, self-fulfilling things. The higher you set your standards, the less tolerance you have for anything that's below that standard.
And it can come across specifically with one of yours, which is control over your time. This can come across as very brutal, very savage, because a lot of people don't have good control over their time, and they don't have standards set for what they allow to occupy their time. And it can make you come across as brutal. I don't mean you individually, but I just mean that people in general who value their time incredibly highly and don't like it to be wasted, it can come across as being very brutal, but I think it's just more effectively allocating your most valuable resources. And if people aren't on the same wavelength as you about that, then it can come across as bad. But for example, people being late, not valuing your time as much as you do, it's something that you may strongly dislike, but people might not necessarily realize because they don't see how much you value your time and how much that is truly worth to you. And I think it's one of those things that it can make you come across as a bit of a dick, but at the end of the day, you have a very finite amount of time and you do not want it to be wasted.
Yeah, and I mean, the last thing I have on this category that fits into that kind of brutal, comes across as brutal, is the people that you spend your time with. Yeah. If you tolerate people who bring you down, you will be brought down. So yeah, that was something that I have used to tolerate a lot. I used to tolerate people that I didn't like or that weren't good for me personally, or just tolerate certain behaviors that people had. And that was, something that I don't tolerate anymore. And it comes across quite brutal. But the way I see it, it's real compassion. It's compassion for yourself, because you're living to your standard, you're owning that identity, and you're setting that boundary. And it's just what you value. And it's also you valuing the other person, or the time that then isn't wasted. Like it comes across as rude sometimes, but I sometimes think it is the most compassionate thing you can do. It's not always the nicest. But if you're being true to yourself and your identity and living your standard, then you're doing the best thing for that person too, because they don't want to waste your time. We're all just being polite about the fact that, we're having this conversation even though we don't want to.
If every single day I gave you a compliment, 5 times a day I complimented you.
I wish.
And now I gave you a compliment, it wouldn't mean much to you. If I never gave you a compliment in your life and then gave you a compliment, that would mean a lot to you. And I think it's the same with the people that you surround yourself with. If you're incredibly brutal about the people that you surround yourself with and you say, this means a lot to me, who I spend time with, then I think the people that you do spend time with, they appreciate it a lot more, because they go, okay, there's only very certain people that you choose to spend your time with, the people that truly matter to you. And I think it means a lot more to them.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And so what do you tolerate now, or what do you not tolerate now that you used to tolerate?
Well, for me, it is online entertainment. I used to play, I basically would do full work days worth of gaming. Like, yeah, I clock on at 9 o'clock and finish at 4 a.m. Like, yeah, be more than the full work day. But I used to game a lot. In all my free time, I would be binge watching YouTube, or I would be scrolling or something. And it was just fine. It was just, okay, I do that. And even after I identified that it was a problem, I never set a proper boundary. You talked about the boundaries. I never set a proper boundary for it. I never defined it properly. And it wasn't until this year that I defined the term online entertainment. Said, okay, this is what it is. I will not allow myself to use this by myself. That was the big change that I made in what I don't tolerate now that I used to, was that now it is just off the cards. And a great example that's come up recently is that the Ashes has just started, which is a test cricket match. It's a 5-match series between Australia and England, and I was really invested in that. I used to watch it a lot. It's very exciting, especially because a few of my family members really like it as well. And I was back in Perth 2 weeks ago when the Ashes was on, and I was around a bunch of my family and we're watching the Ashes, and it was amazing. This week, the Ashes was on. No one was around. So guess what I didn't do? I didn't watch the Ashes, and I really wanted to, but it was just that standard I held myself to, is that, okay, you don't do this by yourself. You use entertainment to connect, not to escape. This is your standard, and you will not fall below this. And even when I was really tempted, not even to watch it live, but just to watch a few highlights or keep up with the score, and it's like, no, that is not what you do. That is not your standard. And it's been hard because it's very much gone against everything I've done for such a long period of time. We talk about standards. Realistically, my standards used to be 4 hours of gaming a day, and scrolling and at least an hour of YouTube a day. Like, that is your bare minimum. You can't fall below that, right? Right. That was my old standard, and now it's the complete opposite. Now it's like, you cannot do this by yourself, and that shift has unlocked a lot for me. But that was the big thing that I identified as something that I will not tolerate now, that I absolutely used to. And I hadn't really thought as much about, the people I surround myself with and the time, but same as you, it's been a huge one, who you choose to spend your time with.
No, it's really interesting. I mean, we're just joking about how that used to be your standard 4 hours of gaming. It really was just the lack of a standard.
Yeah.
And I think that's where most people sit. They've identified at least one of what is the biggest problem for them, but they just haven't set a standard. Or they've tried to set a standard that's just them when they're most motivated, bare knuckled it, and then it's fallen away. I think that is where most people sit. And I think coming back to this idea of, building the fortress, that is how you leapfrog into actually changing your standard, like setting your standard. Like what we're talking about this whole podcast is bridging that gap between, okay, you identify there's a behavior that I'm doing here that I don't like. And there's a behavior that I, would like to replace it with, or a boundary that I need to set for myself. How do I live to that boundary? How do I set that standard? And how do I become that person?
And you made a super important point here, and that is that most people don't have standards. I bet you 90% of the people, if you ask them, what are your standards? They just would not have an answer for that.
Or it would be super vague.
True. And I think specifically the standards I try to set for myself, it's very much input related. I know that if action is going to be the catalyst for change, then your standards have to be based on inputs rather than feelings or emotions. There's time for that, but if you are trying to set behaviors that are going to change you in the long term, it has to be behavioral based, has to be actually input based, which means you have to be as specific as possible. It's when I said before how I'd finally defined the term online entertainment, and I'd been able to define when I can and cannot use it. That was really important because I could get specific about what it is and when it is and is not acceptable. The more vague you are about it, if you say, I want to spend less time on my phone, I want to spend more time exercising, I want to work on my health. That's not a standard. Those are words. They don't mean anything. They're not actions. They're not inputs. You can't base the foundation of your change off words that are ambiguous and vague and don't have specific input derivations.
The only thing you're really doing when you're being ambiguous there is allowing yourself to snake your way back to where you were.
Yeah.
Because you can just, rearrange how it looks in your head and what you really said, and like, oh, but maybe this starts tomorrow, or like, but I didn't really mean in this situation. You're just allowing yourself to get back to where you were because you're leaving it ambiguous.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree. A big part of it is like the devil is in the details. But I feel like we're playing with this balance of setting standards, goals that are specific and, they have parameters and they're defined, but it not being like outcome or timeline based. It's completely within your control. And I think that's something that we need to touch on, is that everything has to be within your control. Otherwise, that's just going to be the first excuse as to why you don't meet that standard anymore.
Yep, 1,000,000%. One of the things that I've really liked about removing online entertainment in general is removing the amount of attention allocation that you have to things outside of your control and trying to bring all of your focus into just what is within your control. And I think the exact same thing applies to your standards, is the inputs, the actions that you have to be within your control. They are controllable things. There's no specific time deadline on when you have to achieve an outcome. It is purely things, actions that are absolutely 100% within your control.
Yeah, and I think you get so much benefit from that, especially in periods where you want to make progress, you want to increase your standards. Sure, there's periods of time where maybe you want to give more of your focus, more of your energy into outward things that are out of your control and just experiencing things. But if we're talking about wanting to improve your life, wanting to set better standards for yourself, you have to be focusing on the things that are within your control. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
100%.
Which brings me to, when should I raise my personal standards?
And this, when should you, or when shouldn't you?
Well, both.
Okay. Well, when you should raise your personal standards, I think, is when you've identified that there is a goal that you want to achieve and there is things that you need to do to get to that outcome that are not something that you're doing on a consistent basis. And I think the opposite to that is when you shouldn't try and raise your standards would be when you cannot be consistent. So it's the same either side, is that if you cannot be consistent with these actions, then you should not use that to increase your standards. For example, if you're in a period of huge motivation and you say, I want to work out every single day, can you be consistent with that? Because if the answer is no, then that cannot be your standard. Because one of the things that you said is you might have times where you want to be able to experience things and outward things. And the point is that your standards shouldn't be so restricting that they prevent you from experiencing things and enjoying things. They should be things that you can do on a consistent basis. So the same thing applies if you have a big goal that you're trying to achieve, then there has to be actions that you can do on a consistent basis. And if you're not currently doing them on a consistent basis, then it probably has to be a standard.
Where do you think most people start with what is a level where they can be consistent? Like, what level of themselves should they be thinking about? Because, when you're at peak motivation, you go to 100%. What literally is the most I could do in a week? Okay, that's what I'm going to do. And then, of course, you can't do it. Is it 50%? Is it 70%? Is it 20%? Like, where do you think most people start at? Or is it a muscle that, you build and then you can increase the percentage of when you can set these standards? What percentage of your energy, of your concentration, of your focus should you be setting that standard?
Okay, so first of all, we had a whole podcast on this, 80-20s. What are the activities? What is the 20% of activities that you can do that are going to get you 80% of the results? Then I would say go as low as possible. 10% of what you can possibly do. 20% of your potential. Because what we're trying to do is exercise the muscle of consistency. And if it means that you have to start small and slowly build, you can raise your standards over time. But the worst thing I think you can do is fall below your standards, because you're constantly training the muscle of, I can slip below these standards and that is acceptable. One of the big things for me this year is being, you cannot fall below these standards and it is unacceptable. You cannot do it. And I think the more times that you do fall below those standards, the more time you allow that to happen, the weaker your standards become. So your standards need to be as strong as possible. You cannot fall below that. And that generally means that you have to start as small as possible and slowly start adding over time. Identifying the actions that are going to get you the biggest returns in the long run is going to be the best place to start. And then doing them at a frequency that you can manage, that you can actually do on a long-term basis. You talked about how you're running a marathon a month. You have a lot of different things on your plate right now. You're currently in a full-time job. You have a lot of different goals you're focusing on. So you said, okay, I can run once a week. That is my standard, okay? That is, for most people, I mean, even for most people, they can't do that. But for you, that is very manageable, right? That is something that you can do. And then when you have more time, when there's more that you can do, you can start increasing. But having that standard as low as possible so that you can be consistent is the most important thing, to not fall below it.
Yeah, I think you've uncovered a real nugget there that I don't think we've properly articulated yet, that the first standard you have to set for yourself is that I do not fall below my standards. Like, you talk about the strength of your standards, because all people really do is set unachievable standards, fall below them, and all they're reinforcing is that I fall below my standards, I fall below my standards, They just make the standards meaningless because they set them too high and they fall beneath them. So I think the best thing you can do is say to yourself, my standard is that I do not fall below my standards, and then make your standards the most achievable thing. And then do that for 3 months. Okay, then your identity is I don't fall below my standards. So you can start, maybe they're 10% better than whatever. But it's really important, I think. And I have definitely experienced that all throughout the past few years, that weakening of my standards. Whenever you do have those low periods and you realize, okay, well that bar was unachievable. Then it starts chipping away at the most important thing, who are you? Do you live up to your standards, or do you allow yourself to break?
Yeah. Now that is, it's just such an important point. Is that if you're allowing yourself to fall below the standards, think about when you are about to enter a period of downward regression, basically out of motivation. It usually happens because one thing has slipped up, and then you've gone, and then the next thing slips, and then you start falling downhill. It's usually a chain of events that happen because you slip below the standards. So I love what you said there, is that the first standard you set is that you cannot fall below those standards. You have to meet those standards, because as soon as one thing falls, that's usually when the house of cards comes down, the dominoes fall, and you generally fall to what your true standards really are.
Yeah, and it has to be when you're at your lowest. I'm not going to break this standard when I'm at my lowest. That is your barometer for where the standard needs to be within your capacity. And that's the big thing I want to talk about with when I think you should or shouldn't raise your personal standards, is about your capacity. How much energy do you have to allocate to maintaining this standard? Because it's going to take life force from you. It's going to take energy and focus. And you got to use that barometer of when you're at your lowest, what is achievable for you. At different times in your life, you're going to have different levels of capacity. So you need to set it at a level which you can always maintain, so you can keep that strength of standard, that I do not fall below it. The other thing that I think is important to touch on of deciding when to change personal standards is when you're going through periods of change of environment. We talked about that for a whole podcast. Change of people you're interacting with. We talked about that for a whole podcast. When you're going through these big life events, new job, living in a new place, it's naturally a period where you're resetting standards, because your routine changes, your actions are changing, your inputs are changing. So it's a great time to reflect on, okay, what capacity am I at as a person right now, even at my lowest? What are my standards? Because sometimes you're not even increasing the amount of capacity that you need to complete these things. Then they're not more difficult. It's just changing what it is sometimes. It's just a substitute that can be almost the lowest hanging fruit sometimes. And when you're changing environments or going through periods of change in general, it's I think the best opportunity to implement a change of personal standard.
Yeah, the environment is such a big one. It can almost allow you to be reborn. And part of the issue I have with the change of environment thing is that a lot of people are waiting for a change of environment. They go, all right, everything is going to change because it's going to be a new year, new me, or I'm going to finish my job and then everything's going to change, or I'm moving to a new state and everything is going to change, and then they wait. I believe our previous podcast was leading with action. Action is absolutely the first thing to do, no matter what position you were in. But yes, changing that environment can have a massive impact. And before we move on, I just wanted to discuss something quickly, which is when you are at your lowest, as you were talking about, and you set a standard for yourself, if you hold it and you're really your lowest, that feels really, really good. And there's been two points last month where I really had to test that. Two nights where we had huge boozing nights, right? First one, I woke up with a 3% recovery score, and I only had to run a 5K. So I was like, okay, we're going to do this. I really don't want to do this. We're going to do this. And I ran a PR. And then the second one, I woke up, another huge night with a 4% recovery score. I had to run 24Ks, which is over a half marathon. I really didn't want to do it. Just got out there. I started running. It really didn't feel good. I just kept going and I finished it. And I was like, wow, this is who I truly am. This feels incredible because I was able to do these things despite being at my lowest. This is truly my standard, and that feels really good because you solidify that as your base of who you are. That feels absolutely amazing, and I want you guys to be able to feel that as well because it's powerful.
Yeah, it's a real pat on the back to yourself, and a lot of times you don't get the opportunity to test that. And so I think what I would tell myself when you're setting these standards, when you're thinking about these ideas, is think about those moments when it's going to be really tough. What am I going to do? And just have a little thought, because that is the only moment where it's ever going to count. It's all well and good for us to talk about what are your standards going to be when you're just, you are at your baseline or you are feeling pretty good. But there's only probably a couple of moments in each week or in each month where you get the opportunity to test who are you, and really think about, okay, this is a test of who I am. What am I going to do? Don't just see it as oh, this is just a moment of weakness. This is just one day. Reframe how you think about it in your mind, that this is a test of who I am, because when you make the right choice, it just reaffirms who you are, and it does feel so good.
Yeah, it is an amazing feeling, and I want to touch on how we can start raising our standards today. What do you think? What are the 3 things that you can do right now to raise your standards?
I struggled not to put this at number 1, time audit. But the way I think about it, coming at it this time, is in some way record yourself and try to record yourself at your lowest. Not only does no one ever do it enough, but you will learn so much about yourself if you just write or put yourself in front of a camera, or just record how you feel, what you're doing across that breadth of emotion, because that's how you're going to identify what your real standards are, and that's how you're going to start to be able to own who that person is. Until you do that, it's all wish-washy. You're not really going to set a standard for yourself. You have no strength of standard. The next thing I would do is tell everyone I care about what the standard is. It's all well and good to build up self-accountability. I think that's a huge, important thing that everyone should do. But lean on the support that you have. Tell people who you care about, this is the standard I've set for myself, because they will help you, remind you, reaffirm it as part of your identity. But then you also have to live up to their standard of you, which for some people is higher than the standard for themselves. So I think that can be a big unlock depending on who you have around you. And yeah, the last thing for me is just start small and stay consistent. We touch on it every time, but consistency. And the smaller you start, the easier you make it to be consistent. Simple as that.
We're very consistent about talking about consistency, aren't we?
Yeah, there's one consistent thing in these podcasts is that we will talk about consistency.
I like that. And I really like that you talk about recording yourself at your lowest, because who's doing that? Like, that's a very difficult thing to do.
It's super tough because it is owning who that person is, and it is exposing them to yourself. And it's like, it's there for you to look back on. It's, it exists now. It's not just something you can forget about, throw in the closet. But the couple of times I've done it, like I had a real low point this year. And I was actually away in one of the camper vans by myself. I was doing like a little, recording some content for the brand, and just testing out some new spots. And I was just all in my head about a few different things, just feeling overwhelmed. And instead of just turning over the pillow and just trying to sleep it off, I was like, okay, I'm just going to put my camera up and I'm just going to talk. This is how I feel. This is what I'm thinking about. And being able to look back on that a week later, a month later, and go, wow, bit of perspective. That's what you were thinking about. That's what you were talking about. Those are the standards you really had for yourself. Like, you'll never be able to do that unless you expose who that person is and you're not afraid to capture it, to be able to reflect on it.
Especially when you have that long-term thinking about what you're doing. A lot of the time when we capture these moments, you're capturing a very important arc in the story, in the character, the low points, because these are generally what's shaping us. And I think if we're avoiding this, it's because we have some fear that we're not going to amount to the person we want to become. But if we truly believe that we're going to become the person we're going to become, then these moments become very precious and very valuable. And I think there's less fear around just recording them and laying them out there as, this is how I feel right now. This is the position I'm in. Here it is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that self-belief that you are going to make it to the end goal, to the horizon, it really does just unlock the ability to see all those moments as gems of things that you're going to want to look back on. Like, I can think of, lots of famous influential people talk about, I wish I'd captured what it was like in the trenches, because no one ever does, because it's embarrassing. But when you do make it, that's what you want to be able to show people. Like, this is where I was, this is who I was. And you want to be able to reflect back on, that was when it was most difficult, and like, this is what I did. Because essentially that is who you are. Like, we keep talking about, like, you are your standards. You need to like take that on as part of who you are when you are in the trenches, that low point.
Yeah, and the second part, or point number 2 that you said, was to share with other people your standards, your friends and family. And I mean, this goes back to the fortress concept of social implications. As soon as it benefits you in 2 ways. First of all, when you tell other people what your standards are, what your goals are, it sets that standard for them. They know, okay, this is who you are. If you fall below that, I'm now lying to a bunch of people I care about. That's the first one. But the second thing is that you're reaffirming your identity around certain behaviors. You're saying, this is who I am. I'm going to tell other people this because this is my identity. You're strengthening 2 core layers of the fortress there. And in my opinion, particularly your personal identity, this is going to have the longest term impact over your behaviors because it's so core and intrinsic to who you are. So I think that's really, really valuable.
Yeah, thanks. I agree. Now, I want to know for you, what are the 3 things that you would do to raise your personal standards?
Okay, so the way I think about personal standards and the way you would probably want to try and improve it is trying to set a set of behaviors that are going to help you to move towards your goals. So first of all, what are your goals? I probably asked this question a lot of times in a lot of the podcasts, but you have to know what your goals are. Once you're very clear about specifically what your goals are, the second thing that we would be doing is trying to figure out what's the biggest lever that's going to allow you to achieve your goals. Now, if you go to the 80-20 episode that we did, you're going to know, okay, these are the actions that I take that are going to give me an outsized return on my time. If I do these few things, they're going to get me 90-95% of the way there without worrying about all this extra junk. So figuring out what are the core behaviors that I need to do to get me to my goal. That's the second step. And the third step is really just making that a standard for yourself. As you say, starting slow, making that, okay, this is my standard, this behavior, this is what I do. This is going to move me towards my goals. I do not fall below this. Set it small. Do not fall below that standard. And then I would come back to this 1 to 3 months later and add on. Previously in this podcast, I ran through my standards, and there's a lot of them now, but it didn't start like that. I probably added a new standard every 2-3 months. Okay. It's a slow iterative process. And over time, you're going to adjust to the standards. It's going to become a part of you. It's not going to seem difficult. If you try and add in a huge amount of standards at the start, it's going to be overwhelming. You're going to fall below the standards. That's going to become an easy thing for you to do. And you're probably going to go back to where you were. But if you figure out, okay, this is the one thing I need to do. This is my standard. I'm just going to focus on this. I can slowly improve it if I have more capacity, not too fast. And then I can start adding in further down the line, but being very slow and conscious about it. Specifically actions that are going to have big returns in your time towards the goals you want to achieve.
Yeah. I mean, you lay it out so clearly every time, and maybe, if you've listened to a few clips here, you might think it's a bit repetitive, but there's a reason for that. Like, it's so fundamental to aligning correctly and then, setting these fundamental ideas within yourself that allow you to achieve these things. Like, it really does start small, but I commend that you're able to bring these ideas to life in such simple steps in ways that are so obtainable just by taking these small actions. But we're just leveraging the compounding effect of consistency over long time horizons. You've never promised to anyone that you're going to be able to do anything in a week or in a couple of days. Like, change, the type of change that we're talking about when it's, personal growth or, identity, doesn't happen overnight. And I think if that's maybe the first limiting belief that you have to overcome if you're actually wanting to change.
And I think it's a huge problem, particularly in the online selling space, is that people are always selling something with a deadline on the outcome. Achieve X in Y period of time. And it gives people this perception that you're going to achieve these things incredibly quickly. And when that's not met, then what? Are you going to quit? Like, what is going to happen? These deadlines are so arbitrary, but they hold so much power in our heads, and they hold so much influence over the actions that we take and how we choose to take actions towards our goals. Because if you didn't have that dial, if you didn't have that timeline, if you didn't have that deadline for your goal, you might think, okay, well, I probably want to try and do these actions in a way that I can do them for the rest of my life or over a longer time horizon. But if you're trying to see, okay, I need to earn $10,000 a month in 3 months, you're probably going to take very, very different actions.
Yeah, you're going to go rob a bank instead of doing the thing that you actually wanted to do that fulfills you and gets you to that goal.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's such a huge shift that I think you have to make internally before you can really start making any progress, because otherwise you're just shooting yourself in the foot, because you said there, what happens if you get to the outcome and then, you don't make it? Like, what then? What happens if you get to the outcome and you do make it? It's still what then? Like, there has to be a longer vision to which things can build towards. And like, I'm all for breaking it down, having, some goals that are obtainable along the way. But you really need to be shifting your identity to become something that just to have like a long-term horizon about any sort of progression, because otherwise you fall back or it slips away. Like, you think about all these people who have weight loss goals, and it's always, a number, an amount of weight by a certain time, and maybe they achieve it, maybe they don't. It's kind of irrelevant, because usually they all recede back to their previous weight, and it's because that was a stupid goal to begin with. The goal was really, I want to become a healthier person. Yeah. Indefinitely. Like, that is really the goal there.
And that's one of our podcasts, is aligning goals with you and having the right goals. Because as you said, then what, right? I want to lose 20 kilos in 6 weeks. I've done it. Then what? Or I haven't done it. Then what? It's the wrong goal, because the goal has a specific timeline and there's no long-term vision to it. It's because, as you say, what was the point of that goal? What was the purpose behind that goal? The goal is not to lose 10 kilos in 6 weeks. The goal is to be healthier over the long term, to look better, to feel better, to be, live longer for your friends and family, these kind of things. It's the wrong goals.
Yeah. No, and I think setting standards is a good little in between connecting that vision to what you're actually doing, to the actions that you're holding yourself accountable to day in, day out. Because that is kind of part of the problem with having goals that are so long term. You know, it just feels like a vision. But when you can set your standards, it makes them achievable. It makes daily actions align with what that vision is. You can see the progress, you can feel it.
And particularly making the goals the actions. If you make your goal to take the actions, that is very helpful. And if you make your goal to do the standards that are the actions, very, very helpful. Versus the goal is a outcome, the goal is the actions. And we've talked about that before, but I think that's a big one, is linking the goal to the actions rather than the outcome. Because you will either get to an outcome or not get to an outcome, but it's like, then what? If it is the actions that were the goal, then there is an indefinite period of time that you can continue to do that and continue to see results.
Yeah, it works so well synchronizing with setting a standard, like thinking about action-based, 100%.
Yeah. All right, excellent. Well, that was Setting Personal Standards. That was episode 8. We're about to move on to a Q&A call in the Modern Monk community. If you're not part of the community, then what are you doing? Got to join. If you do, you're going to get 30-day early access to all this stuff. You'll be able to watch the Q&A calls or the podcasts live and join the Q&As after. So if that's interesting, it's free. I'll leave a link in the description below for that. And we'll see you next week.
Get involved. See you next week.
Cheers.